You must have been there. So, in that case, the time you're 15, you get better. It's so actually worse than you are. I'll let you all.
Hello, everyone. Okay, let's start. This is TRAM. This is the note well. Logistics, I'll be the minute taker. Do we have a Jabber scribe? It's not necessary, but if anyone wants to do it, would be nice. Okay, nobody's nice in this room. Nobody cares about Jabber.
Seriously, I mean, somebody please log in into Jabber. Okay, yeah. No, because I cannot do that because I'm projecting from my laptop. So yeah, that'd be enough. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you. Materials are here, and the mailing list is at that address, and the archives that are there. This is the agenda for today. So basically, we have 2 working group drafts that need to be discussed, and then we have extra time for extracurricular work. Changes since last time. We have a new charter. It's just been approved. It's not very different from the old one, so I just took the one paragraph that was changed and highlighted the changes. So basically, we are more explicit now about the stun and turn protocols being used in a variety of environments. One thing that was discussed in the rechartering but is not apparent in the charter text is that sometimes it is hard to understand the changes that we make, how they apply to each of those environments. So it would be nice if in the future we would make that more explicit in the draft texts. So as we go, we'll be checking for that. And basically, we have two new mechanisms that we're working on, path MTU discovery mechanism and an IP address mobility solution for turn. The milestones have been updated accordingly. We have also updated the dates of the milestones so that they correspond to reality. So basically, we have to adopt new stuff in November. So right after this is done, we'll be adopting two new drafts. And then if I look at March 2016, that's when we expect the turn path MTU discovery draft to be sent to IESG. And then July 2016 would be when we would send the turn IP address mobility draft to IESG. We hope to be done with stun bis and turn bis before then. All right. Status of working group drafts. Stun Origin has had one revision. It's been updated in response to IESG evaluation and in response to the discussion that had taken place in Prague. We'll have a presentation on that later. Stun path data had one revision. It went through, actually it was updated in response to working group last call comments, and it is now ready for IESG. We just need to send it to them. Turn server discovery has had two updates. Working group last call is done. It was updated in response to comments received and is now ready for IESG. We have a presentation on that later as well. Now, stun bis and turn bis. Stun bis has had no new revision and is actually now an expired draft. That's not cool. We need to get that done. As far as I know, there are a few minor to-dos on that draft. Is there any author present here who could, give us a heads up? So I think all the authors of that draft are not at this IETF, so I don't see any of them in the room. How about turn bis? Turn bis had two revisions. Good progress there. Are we done? So same question, are we done with that draft? I see Alan nodding. All right, so what we'll try to do next is talk to the authors and make sure we're ready to go to last call. And if it looks like we're ready, then we'll just do it. Okay. Okay. Right. All right. Thank you.
Justin Uberti. And one thing that we talked about in Prague that I haven't seen updated yet either was the ability to have a smaller Mac even when using SHA-256. And so, Brandon, have you seen any discussion of that on the list? Okay. Yeah, so yeah, that was one thing I wanted to talk about today, but I guess we'll need to take to the list.
So is there a proposal on the table for a smaller Mac?
Well, it was discussed at Prague. I can try to find it in the minutes, but basically it was truncating SHA-256 Mac, so we didn't have to have the full 16 bytes for something that really, or I guess was it 32 bytes for something that really didn't need 32 bytes, in addition to, possibly also the 20 byte, regular message integrity. So I can try to dig up what we decided, but I thought there was enough for the authors to go forward.
Okay. Okay, we'll follow up with the authors. Thank you. New work. So this is basically the result of the rechartering that we've done. We're asking the authors to simply resubmit their drafts under a new name, and we'll just start the process with those drafts. And that's it for the status. Next presentation is Turn Server Auto Discovery. Is it on?
Yeah.
Any better now? Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I'm Prashant, one of the authors of the auto discovery draft. Next slide, please. Yeah, not much has changed. A quick recap of the discovery mechanisms. Not much has changed in the last 3 or 4 revisions. It's the same. Most of the comments that we've got are around other text security considerations and ordering of mechanisms in which a client would discover and so on. There was some confusion on local configuration as to what makes up local configuration. We've added text around it. We've now included to say a turn server configuration from an application or JavaScript, for example, would be considered local configuration. Next slide, please. Yeah, minor changes from 04 to 05. There was also some confusion on the ordering in which a client would, the order in which a client would discover this, the turn servers. The latest draft does not prescribe a strict order. A client could choose to perform all in parallel or in any desired order. We've updated the security considerations as well. We had recommended the use of DTLS, TLS for to validate a turn server once you discovered it. So we've added some text around how you would go about validating it, with the prescribed list of servers that you like, or using raw public keys, or if you didn't know the server at all, you do opportunistic encryption, stuff around that. Next slide, please. We have received some comments on if the discovery draft should return. It's not been very obvious if we should do it, because at least personally, I believe the return draft deals with server selection and not really server discovery. So yeah, there has to be some discussion. Sure, go ahead.
Says Andy Hutton. I think I made that comment.
Yes.
So I think actually the draft does talk about RTC Web, and it does talk about enterprises. So not to mention return, I think at all would be very confusing. So I think at least there should be some explanation that return is just a turn server, if you like.
Yes, but again, the discovery draft, in terms of enterprises or WebRTC or whatever it is, tries to solve the problem of how do you go about discovering a server, right? If you've discovered multiple servers, which happens to be the case, then the return draft would say how you'd go about it. If you wanted privacy, you choose the enterprise first, and then another server for cloaking, right? But that's mostly a use case and how a server selection choice would be made.
I don't think I disagree with you, but I just think this draft, if it talks about RTC Web, it talks about turn and it talks about enterprises. If it doesn't mention return at all, that's very confusing to a reader, I think. So it needs to at least have some reference.
Okay, so so in what capacity would we refer? Just just a couple of lines saying if you happen to discover multiple servers and
Yeah, I'm
looking
not
at
sure
privacy
actually.
goes from
I need to think about that, but
right.
yeah, I think we need at least some text to talk about the relationship with return.
So Andy, are you suggesting a normative reference or just informative?
Probably informative. I maybe need to think about it a bit. I'm sure Justin and others would have comments probably, but yeah, it needs to say something at least. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think Justin Birdie. I mean, I think the main thing is that the return document will have a normative dependency on this document.
Yeah.
And so to avoid creating a totally circular reference, I think this, when talking about like what its possible applications are, might want to mention return as a area where this sort of technique would be useful, and then just have that as an informative reference.
Okay.
That works for everyone? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's it really. I'm done. Yeah, next slide. Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah. Yep. Yep.
Basically relies on, if you're concerned about this, you can use TLS or ETLS for your transport. And mechanism like auto discovery that may limit your ability to use TLS and ETLS under some scenarios perhaps requires a little bit more text about the attack scenarios that the main term RFC relies on TLS or ETLS to mitigate.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. So we've had some discussions and we've added some text around that. Right? But again, there isn't much you can do because you're discovering a turn server. If you know the turn server, you know how to validate it. If you don't know it, there is very little you can do. You have to go for opportunistic encryption if that's what you want to do.
I'm mostly getting at sort of calling those things out.
Yeah, we've called those things out in the latest draft. Okay.
Making it clear to people that if you're relying on auto discover turn servers, there are attack scenarios called out in the turn draft that may be more problematic.
Sure. Yeah.
As a result, I'm not suggesting a significant amount of text.
Just
making it clear to people so that they at least go and look at the other draft and read it carefully around mitigations that require TLS.
Yeah, we can be more explicit about that. Yeah, we'll do that.
All right. So new revision needed?
Yep.
And then
and
we
then
can
we should be
send it
good
to
go, I
IETF.
suppose. Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Cool.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I'm Alan Johnson presenting the stun origin attribute on behalf of the other co-authors, Justin, John, and Kunton. Next. So after Prague, we had some good list discussion, and the 06 version that was done recently updates the draft with those changes. The most important change is that the origin attribute now is only shared if the domain of the origin matches the domain of the stun and turn URI that you used. And I have details on that on the next slide. Oops, hold on. No.
Oh, you have details on the next slide.
Yeah, details are on the next slide. And the goal for that is to not generate new metadata. If you remember, the discusses and what we talked about in Prague were not leaking new usage information to third-party stun and turn servers. So this way, essentially, you only share usage information with yourself. So you're not generating new metadata. And this still covers many of the use cases, although not every single one that we had originally planned. We also removed the text on sending an empty origin. Now, if you don't want to send it, you just don't include it. And we also removed the different handling based on the different usages. That was kind of a placeholder because we just weren't sure exactly, what SIP and XMPP might use it for, but it ended up just being more confusing. So there's no specific differences in handling between the different origins. We believe this will clear the discusses, but we haven't contacted the various ADs to get them to do that. We wanted to check with the working group and make sure that everyone was good with this direction. Okay, now next slide. So this is basically the text from the draft about the matching rule. It basically compares the entire domain, so the fully qualified domain name, and if it doesn't match, then it's a must not send. And the matching does not include ports, and it does not include secure or non-secure. So a couple of examples there. What this does mean that you do need the full domain name there. So if you have a www in your web domain, then unfortunately your stun or turn URI needs to begin www as well. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to operate your stun and turn from the same IP as your web server. You can always use SRV or some other mechanism such as a alternate server redirection to send it somewhere else. Okay. And these are the main use cases that are still supported, even with this no metadata generating approach. So it still allows you to operate a stun and turn server and basically silently ignore requests that don't originate from your own domain. For multi-tenanted stun and turn servers, it allows you to do the realm selection, and it also allows you to do logging and policy differentiation between various users of that stun and turn server. And also there's other potential uses, including Cullen's firewall traversal draft as well.
I'm concerned about the first and the third bullets here. My view of them and more detailed discussion in the draft suggests that these are basically providing motivation to lie to the center, which is one of the things that the ADs, security ADs, were asking about in the discussions. Would basically, is there a motivation to lie? Basically, what we were saying is, well, no, the way that we're describing it being used, there's really no motivation to lie. If you lie, you're still not going to be able to pay anyway. Now the draft is providing a couple of rationales for a couple of use cases where there in fact is a motivation to lie, potentially. It sort of, for example, could allow you to get through a firewall rule if you lie about the domain that you're connecting to the region. On the middle point, my sense of the discussion on the list was that there were some fairly mixed opinions on the list about whether origin, with the limitations that the draft now discusses, is actually still useful or the best way to cover that particular use case. There was some discussion on the list about the third-party auth, and the get the third-party auth being perhaps a more reliable way to do the same thing. I think the third-party auth draft is a little longer specified at the moment to be used for that purpose, but origin attribute along with the third-party auth. Origin attribute could potentially be moving the scope, the kit for third-party auth, in order to provide a little uniqueness. But on its own, I think my sense of the discussion on the list was that the working group didn't seem to have a clear consensus to me that we're still at a point where we're going to serve that. So I'm concerned that we might not have use cases for origin spelled out that that we're all in agreement about the usefulness of.
No.
So, I mean, we do have remote participants. We do have remote people, so.
This one's working.
So I think, the face-to-face meeting is the ideal time to resolve the, thank you, Gonzalo, it was working. To resolve exactly that question of whether this meets the use cases or not. And I think it does. And on the, little side comment first, the latest version of the firewall draft went off using this because we thought it wouldn't go forward, but it will instantly be moved in the next version back to using this if we go forward with it, right? It's a use case for it. You can argue that those things do create incentives to lie, but keep in mind that both the client inside, like the browser in this case, would have to have its code modified to lie, and also the person providing the turn server and who's providing the authorization credentials has to also be willing to lie and give credentials to somebody who wouldn't have them. So once you have a case where both the inside and outside are willing to lie, there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop any of this anyway. So I think any discussions on that topic are ridiculous. Now, when we start talking about the authorization, we inevitably need some way to do exactly this mechanism. And this is a mechanism that is simple and easy to understand and could be used by simple authorization mechanisms or be used by complicated authorization mechanisms. But the idea of requiring an incredibly complicated authorization mechanism as just a painful bunch of hoops you have to hop through to reveal exactly the same information in the end, that's just not really practical. I don't see the point in that. So, I hope we can sort of drive it to conclusion today, but it seems to me that everything that's been proposed as an alternative to this is far more complicated and does all the same things as the downsides of this anyway. So I'm just not, this just seems like a really nice small building block that is useful by itself and useful in the broader case of the more complicated things. So I'd like to see it go forward.
Yeah, I mean, these are basically the same use cases that we started with this draft. These aren't new use cases. And we have had the IESG discussion. And I think we addressed their concerns about the lying, right? Which is essentially that if you're really using it for that you shouldn't use it for strong authentication, and that the credential mechanism is the obvious next step for the further authentication that you would need to do.
Jonathan Lennox. So, I mean, the thing that the firewall draft moved to was a host header. So I guess my question is, what is now the advantage of this over a host header, given that you can't use it if it wouldn't match the host header, but there's cases where you're not allowed to send it at all in this case? Is it just the path and scheme part of the URI that people find so crucial?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think the host header had the same metadata issues associated with it, so it would require similar rules to this.
Other than the encoding of the letters O-R-I and H-O, I can't tell the difference between the two, right? I think they've reduced to identical things for all intents and purposes.
No, the difference is if I'm using a third-party turn server that doesn't match the URI I'm coming from, yeah, host would be valid, but origin would not. That is the significant difference. So like if I'm doing a multi-tenanted turn server, where, it's the people I'm allowing, very few different people to connect to it, but they're not necessarily coming from my domain or maybe a different subdomain of mine. I can use it for certainly the second bullet point here, but whereas origin would not work for that.
Okay.
All right. So there are definitely people who seem to think that this is good, necessary, useful. Does anyone think that this is a bad idea, that it will break things, that we should not do it, that it is a security risk? Now would be a good time to speak up. All right.
I think what I heard Jonathan saying, I think matches my feeling, is it's not clear exactly the utility here. I don't think it's a security risk. It just doesn't cover a lot of scenarios.
Is it that it is not as useful as it could be, or that it cannot be more useful?
Well, I think really the concern is that, and I've mentioned this before, that since we have third-party auth and some other mechanisms like that, those give more tools.
Right.
And this is a lighter weight, cheaper way of doing, a reduced set of things.
Right. That's how I see it. I see third-party auth as this big thing that not a lot of people want to have the burden to implement, but still get the benefits of this.
Yeah, although like this won't be trivial either, just because of the fact that the way you need to set up your site and turn server will require a little bit extra munging, so that you can basically serve an initial turn response from the same address as is resolved for your website. And so like there's a very small sliver of like people for whom this would actually probably be very useful.
Right.
I mean, to be honest though, I feel like it would be great to get implementer feedback, because I think that, from our perspective, we can make different decisions about, oh, this is hard or this is easy. It would be good to hear somebody who's actually building a site and saying, oh yeah, I'd rather use this than have to use third-party auth. And they could probably make a better determination than we can, because we spend all our time thinking about this. And for us, like third-party auth, we understand how it works. I'd like to get implementer feedback as to, like, is that hard to use or not, and would they prefer this?
Well, I think comparing this to third-party auth is like comparing, skateboards to race cars or something, right? I mean, they're two very different things. Okay, I'm not saying this is a replacement for third-party auth, but setting those up on site is, the total difficulty is, largely provisioning SRV records, and that turns out to be a very easy thing for lots of small sites to do. They do it for email or similar DNS records for email, for XMPP, for other things. There is some bar to getting somebody to configure a DNS record for sure. Some sites can't do it, but an awful lot of sites can. It's pretty easy.
Yeah, Alan and I talked about this a lot yesterday. Like right now, I don't know if Firefox does, but Chrome doesn't support SRV records for the turn URIs, and I don't expect that to change in the immediate future. So right now, like the other mechanism that Alan mentioned, where you basically have an A record for the turn server that then hits like your web server, and then does a alternate server that then points you where you need to go, will be the only way you could get this to work.
Yeah, I think ultimately getting SRV records going for stun and turn is going to be important.
I'm not saying you guys will or will not do it, but I will note that I'm pretty sure SRV records are mandatory to implement for WebRTC devices, right?
Well, if you look at the turn URI spec, the turn URI spec says like, yeah, there's just like complicated way you have to like say, well, if this thing's here, then USB, or if this thing's here, do this other thing. And since that's a must implement for WebRTC, you could say it's a dependent or transitive sort of requirement. Just from a practical time frame, like no one has asked us for this, you know. So like I don't think, or not this being Origin, but this being SRV. So like I wouldn't expect this to change like in the immediate future.
Okay, let's take a hum. What the question is?
No, but I mean, like, I mean, do you guys think we need more discussions on the list, or people can leave basically with a proposal, or, you know, that's what we need to understand actually?
The main thing I would like to see is like some, you know, person who basically is implementing turn services, you know, TalkBox or Twilio or somebody saying, yeah, we definitely want this and we're going to implement it. And if there's a large enough sort of set of people who want to do this, we should just do it. I just don't want to write a document that no one's actually going to implement.
We're implementing it for our Spark product, whether you standardize it or not. The idea that you've already, as a working group, decided to send this to the ISG and spin it through working group last call, IETF last call, and now you're about to take a hum of whether you want to do it or not, leaves me somewhat surprised.
Yeah, we're definitely implementing it as well in our stun and turn and SBCs and in our products.
Brandon Williams again. I think the reason for the question is specifically due to the changes that have gone in response to the ISG discuss. That, you know, prior to the changes and the limitations, this looked more useful to me and looked like something that that our service might actually implement and make use of. In its current form, it isn't. You know, I have to use the third party auth because that's the only thing that makes sense for my service. And the Origin, given the limitations, is enough less useful that it stops being meaningful to implement for us. That's sort of the feedback I've got. I also want to mention that I will be sending you know, review comments to the list, but the review comments aside from this particular point are sort of fairly trivial and
great. Thank you.
Jonathan?
Right. Jonathan, I just wanted to ask you, what about this doesn't solve your use cases and what would?
In the presence of, so by having to limit to such an extent that our customers have to do the host name stuff, that it's basically now tied to the nature of the lookup that you're doing.
Yeah. Would a host header solve your use cases?
What?
Would a host header solve your use cases?
It might. Yeah, I mean, it's basically the, you know, what we really wanted was just tell me who you are, or rather tell me what host name you used to, tell me something about the application that you're using this service for, so that I know what to expect in terms of the authentication mechanism, et cetera. I don't get the impression that large customers are going to be particularly interested in, even though, you know, they may have, you know, the DNS infrastructure to handle it. I think they're less interested in creating the DNS records and the SRV records to sort of duplicate what they've already got for their web properties. It ends up meaning that you have a much larger number of DNS entries that you potentially have to manage if you have various different domains within in your realm that you have to.
But all the large, I mean, you're not suggesting that the IP address, you'd run it on the same IP address as your web servers, right?
No, I'm not.
Okay. So it's the same number of DNS records.
I'm talking about if you have a multiplicity of distinctly identified hosts within your application base. This requires you to have the necessary DNS records to map you, essentially to CNAME over to the third-party relay service for each one of those independent hosts, as opposed to just having one master one that you create once and you use because, you know, for us,
Sure.
the relationship
Okay.
is with us.
Right. So that makes sense, but that means the host header would not meet your needs because let's say you had the apps.
Fair enough.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think anything that says, you know, tell any random third party who you are is not going to fly with the IESG in terms of metadata, right? They've made that very clear. That's just not going to go.
So, I mean, what I'm hearing is like, you know, we have a part of the group that think this is useful, even with, you know, after the revision. Some people think it's, you know, useless but harmless, probably. Do we have anyone that thinks this is harmful? We shouldn't be doing that, just to take that option off the table. Okay, and I think, I mean, when Jonathan was pointing out, I mean, do we think that for those of you that think that it's useless but harmless, I mean, can we do something to make it more useful? And we need concrete proposals here because we could be talking about this in the abstract level forever.
Yeah, I'll think about that. And
okay.
Aside from going back to what we were originally proposing.
Right, exactly. So the thing is, like, you know, Brandon has other comments on the draft that he promised to send to the list. So please, I mean, everybody think in those terms, you know, how we could have something that covers, you know, most use cases. And when we get the comments, I mean, we'll be making a decision. But as I said, I mean, we will make a decision based on concrete proposals, like you know what we have here, not just, you know, abstract comments. Okay.
So no hum?
I think, you know, I mean, I think, I mean, the idea is to get people really to provide, I mean, to think about that and how to cover use cases. We can take a hum of who thinks is useful, but if, you know, let's take the sense of the room now we're here. I don't think it's extremely useful, but anyway, so we're going to take a hum who thinks this is useful and we should go ahead, and who thinks that, you know, in this form, this doesn't cover their use cases. So those of you who think that this is still useful and we should go ahead with it, please hum. Those of you who think that, you know, the new revision doesn't cover the use cases anymore, please hum. I mean, I would say it's like 5 people against 2, or I mean, like very, very few people were humming. I mean, it's really a conversation of those of you who went to the mic. So yeah, I didn't see any like big involvement of everybody else who is reading email probably. So yeah, let's have, even we can have a smaller meeting, you know, like, you know, among the 5 of you or something like that, and try to come up with something.
Okay. All right. So we should hold off talking to the ADs, because if they pull their discusses, this will get published, right?
Right. Exactly.
It's ready to go. So
yeah. I mean, Brandon, the timeline for you to send comments is like a few days.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Alan.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so next presentation is metadata discovery for third-party authorized turn session.
Let's see, next slide, please. So the basic idea here is that we've got the stun third-party auth. There has been some discussion of the idea that the OAuth server, or whatever server is controlling the authentication, may want to limit resource utilization, perhaps to dictate maximum bandwidth or maximum number of concurrent sessions using an allocation, maximum allocations, that sort of thing, and that the third-party auth doesn't provide a way to for the authentication server to notify the relay of the resource limitations that it thinks need to be imposed for the related to the authentication token. Next slide, please. So the current draft describes two options for this. One is metadata discovery using token introspection, and the other one is making use of the token itself as an in-band mechanism to communicate the resource limitations. Next slide, please. For the token introspection, the basic idea is that the turn server queries, after receiving the token, queries the OAuth server directly to determine resource restrictions for the token. It would leverage OAuth 2.0 token introspection. Next slide. And these are the basics of the flow. Basically, you get your allocation request plus access token, or rather, you've got your access token request to the auth server. You get an access token and a session key. That goes through to the turn server in the allocate request. And then the turn server is able to, out of band, directly connect to the auth server to get token metadata. That channel with the auth server also provides a mechanism for essentially push-like updates for unsolicited responses. If conditions change.
Marvin Singh. I'm just curious to see if the auth server needs to be that specific auth server, or could it be another URI that could be configured in the turn server to get the metadata from? I
think, and this one I can't speak terribly well to because mine is the other idea, but I believe that the idea is for this to work, it at least has to be part of a common solution base where it can actually identify the token or the session key within the token. Basically, the auth server that produces the access token and the session key would have to provide the details about that session to whatever service you're connecting to in order to get the metadata. I think if the auth server and the signaling server are different entities, for example, provided that the auth server communicates information about the session to the signaling server, then conceivably the turn server could connect to the signaling server in order to get updates about stuff, or
I would like
some other third-party service. I can think of one.
So yeah, that's the motivation, and I'm just wondering if that flexibility could be like worked into the draft so that another third-party signaling or such would be able to, like the turn server could introspect that to get data. And I think this is quite limiting, because if you start scaling the service horizontally, then your load balancers would anyway need to keep state or somehow and I'm not sure if that's sufficient in that sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think a little bit later in the presentation, we've got sort of a pros and cons sort of analysis. And I think that's something that could conceivably get added to the list of pros for this approach, is that sort of separation of responsibilities. Next slide, please. This provides a little bit of details about the introspection request. The URL for and content of the request. And next slide, please. And then sort of the nature of the response would be upstream bandwidth, downstream bandwidth, max allocations, et cetera. And there could conceivably be other bits of metadata that went into the response. Next slide, please. Let's see. In the introspection endpoint attribute, so the draft defines an introspection endpoint attribute that would essentially tell the turn server who to connect to in order to get that information. So in the case that you're describing, Varun, the introspection endpoint would be a system other than the auth server, I think. It would just have to be one that the auth server is aware of and can communicate down to the turn client, so that the turn client can generate a good FQDN. That element definitely isn't called out in the draft in its current form.
Right. One thing again. Yes, and we have a lot of interest from our customers asking for something like this because they generally are either hosting a couple of turn servers or using some other third party to do that, and they would like to, like this relationship is quite complex because there are many third parties involved currently, and everyone's scaling independently. So, so being able to do that in a more consistent way, where third parties who want to communicate with each other, given the service that's being built, wants to do that.
I think you have enough greater visibility into those particular elements of the use case than probably either Tiru or I have, that it would make sense for us to have some more detailed discussion about that offline and get some detailed comments from you on that element of the draft.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Chris went. I haven't necessarily read the draft, but just looking at that flow, typically OAuth and any other entitlement related things are sort of orthogonal concepts. You're just authenticating the user. So implying that 5 and 6 are part of the same flow might be a little dangerous from an OAuth 2.0 perspective.
Yep. Okay.
Justin, you ready? What do you expect clients to actually do with this information?
What do I expect client sessions to do with this information? I'm not sure, really. I think that's a really good question. I'm just not. I'm not particularly certain whether the client session. I think the client session would need to have some visibility into this information in order to do something meaningful with it. And this particular flow, as it's mapped out, doesn't really make that particularly easy. I think the other flow that handles things in band perhaps has, it's less dynamic, but it has a easier way to communicate to the client what the additional metadata is, that the client might be able to make meaningful use of it. But I think would be interested to hear more about what the client might be able to do with that information.
Okay, let me take a step back. So what do you see as the primary use case for this functionality? Is it for a service provider or application provider to sort of who's using a third-party turn server to understand what their cost expectation should be? Or is it for the client to be able to figure out before it gets a token what should it expect? And part of it's just not clear how a client would respond to this, that there are upstream and downstream bandwidth limitations, but really every network has bandwidth limitations, and so the client needs to have some sort of bandwidth estimation and rate control sort of thing anyway. So it's not quite clear what it would do differently with this information.
Yeah, I think it's something that we need to put some more thought into. Next slide, please. Let's see, the notifications from introspection endpoints. This is basically describing the unsolicited responses to the turn server that were in the earlier diagram. That if the call is switching from audio to video or vice versa, for example, and the bandwidth requirements go up, it would give the capability for the signaling server to notify the turn relay that the bandwidth allocation needs to go up, or bandwidth expectations are going to go up. It also could allow the auth server, if it's the auth server that the communication is with anyway, to revoke the access token as soon as a call has completed. Next slide, please. For this approach, the benefits that we see of going with this model, it doesn't require the allocation token to increase in size, and it allows midstream adjustment to the metadata. But on the other hand, it requires a publicly accessible auth server or publicly accessible server to be getting the metadata from And there may be session establishment delays for related to the out-of-band communication. If the out-of-band communication, if that additional metadata is necessary before accepting peer connections or allowing data channels through or something, then that could lead to session establishment delays. Next slide, please. So for the in-band metadata approach that the draft describes, the basic idea is to embed the metadata in the token itself. The draft describes appending essentially stun TLV encoded metadata within the body of the auth token prior to encryption. Next slide, please. And so the flow here is quite a